I'm Kirsten Scheid. I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Media Studies. And we're very proud to be able to host with the Sami Hermez Institute the launch for Sami Hermez's book. Sami was a lecturer in our department for several semesters a couple years back. And now he is assistant professor in residence of anthropology at Northwestern University in Qatar. It's okay. He obtained his doctorate degree from the Department of Anthropology at Princeton University. He has also served as a visiting scholar in the Department of Anthropology at Harvard University, visiting professor of contemporary international issues at the University of Pittsburgh, visiting professor of anthropology at Mount Holyoke College, and postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Lebanese Studies at St. Anthony's College at Oxford University. Sami is currently working on a second book, and he presented last night about that, narrating occupation in rural Palestine. His first already out hard copy book is called War is Coming, Between Past and Future Violence in Lebanon. It's just out with University of Pennsylvania Press. Sami will speak about it to give you an introduction about its contents for about half an hour. And then Nikolas Kosmatopoulos, who is assistant professor of international relations and anthropology here at AUB, will discuss the value, the findings, the significance of the book. And then Sami will respond to Nikolas's assertions, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. And the book is available. It's supposed to be right. It's right out here. It's right out here. Okay, for sale and maybe for autographing too. Okay, thank you, Sami. Please begin.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the SOAM department and to Sami Hermez Institute for sponsoring this event. Let me, before I say anything, go any further, give you the good news and the bad news. The good news first. No, there is no war coming. The bad news is that I've never been one to be a good fortune teller or be one to prophesy. So take the good news with a grain of salt. But in all seriousness, the title isn't a question or a declaration. It is really what I heard people often say in the field while doing research. So for prophesizing, you can go to Michel Hayek or Leila Abdel Latif, and you see this book more as descriptive rather than a kind of prediction of things to come. So it's quite fitting that I present this for the first time, and I launch this book at AUB in the heart of where it all started. And amongst many of you here today. It's been 10 years in the making, and I sort of thought about this moment for a long time, and so it's quite exciting to be here, and to be with people whose stories I try to capture in this book. And so I really hope that the book offers a kind of true reflection of your experiences and your lives, especially to those of you who lived the war, the 1975 to 1990 war, and after. And I hope that you'll find this book useful. It's in many ways for you that I try to write this, for those of you who lived the war. And also the fact that the knowledge in this book, or the analysis in this book, is really the knowledge that's out there, that's that you have, for at least for a lot of the Lebanese in this room. So I've essentially tried to capture that, and I hope I've done a good job. And to the extent that I'm successful is to the extent that you agree with the analyses or not. And I hope that this book starts a discussion or a debate or an attack, I guess. So what I'd like to do today is walk you through how and why I came to write the book, and then to give you some brief snippets of the main arguments. So they'll talk to you a little bit about the theoretical arguments that I make in the book. And I'll finish off with an ethnographic vignette, an episode that I have with an interlocutor during my time doing research. That this research essentially took place between 2006 and 2009, but of course I kept coming back after, so it's in some ways never ended. And I worked with 3 groups of people for this book: former militia fighters, political activists, many of whom became close friends, and relatives, to kind of piece this together. So there were really two, I break it down into 2 reasons why I wrote this book. There was a political context, and there was a very personal reason for writing about this and this topic. When I first came to the field, when I first started in 2006 doing research, it was actually in June, July 2006, so Harb Tammuz, for all of you who were here then. And in those days, then and after, I felt that people were everywhere around me, constantly and almost obsessively talking about the coming war, right? This idea that this war is always coming. And of course, the meaning of this war and our understanding of it, the protagonists, that would change in the imaginations of people. So sometimes there was a war coming with Syria, sometimes it was with Israel, sometimes there was an internal sectarian war that people were imagining. So that changed, but invariably there was an eye to a future that seemed precarious and war-filled. And I felt that in my fragmented conversations around the country, people were collectively trying to tell me a story about their lives as they lived in between past and future war. The other thing was that during this time, I noticed that there were a lot of people and organizations working on trying to preserve memory. And so the memory of past war and on communal peace-building initiatives, on advocating forms of transitional justice. And so I wanted to insert myself into that discussion. I felt that there was something missing in that discussion, and I wanted to insert myself into that discussion. And I wrote this book hoping to offer an alternative for how to think of our past, present, and future in Lebanon, and to stir discussion so that we might arrive at more productive solutions to our recurring political impasses. The book, as I said, does not offer solutions. It's not a manifesto in that sense. And of course, interestingly, between the time I started thinking about this project and today, the world went through many drastic events, especially 2012. And so that really, in some ways, what's interesting is that I hadn't thought about how this might be received outside Lebanon. But today, I think that there might be a lot to think about, for Syrians, whether inside Syria or refugees in the diaspora and so on, who might be able to pick this up and think about how this might relate or not to their situation in their lives. The other aspect was the personal, a personal coming to terms with the effects of war on the lives of people dear to me. I caught glimpses of what war did to my relatives during my childhood visits to the country in times usually of ceasefire and cessation of conflict. And that really had a deep impact on me growing up. My late grandmother would tell me stories of hiding in shelters, not knowing if they would see daybreak. I would witness my uncle crying at the kitchen table as he recounted the death of a friend from sniper fire just days before. And importantly, these memories would resurface whenever the present seemed precarious or at the brink of war. The manifestations of protracted political violence in everyday life were so complex that I wanted to see what I might learn from excavating them. I thought that maybe if I could offer a better understanding of the ways of being and doing in conflict zones, it could lead to an appreciation of the lives of others, their choices, ideas, behaviors, and experiences. And this appreciation for the other, I felt and still feel, would help us structure a more just and equitable politics. So the book begins in 2006. The first page is the introduction. I'm in the Hamra neighborhood of Beirut. It's a very busy place during Harb Tammuz. Many displaced people from the south have made their way to the city, escaping Israel's incessant bombings. And they were basically hiding in school compounds, or they'd taken up new abodes, I guess, in school compounds, underground garages, unoccupied apartments, and other vacant spaces in the city. On this particular afternoon, Dima and I decided to take a break from our relief work and have lunch at Roadster Cafe. I came to meet Dima during this period of relief work in the July War, and with her and others, I would take part in various forms of humanitarian and political action during the course of my fieldwork. We walked down Hamra Street, busy with people, but not so jammed with cars as one would usually expect. We passed by the popular fast food restaurant Malik al-Batata and crossed the cobblestone street to our destination. There, we ordered our food. I don't know if I mentioned Roadster. This is not an advertisement. Sponsorship, right? And there, we ordered our food. I don't say if it was tasty or not, so I'm just leave it at that. As we sat lazily at the bar, waiting for our food to arrive, we got into what would be one of our many sad and fervent conversations about war, its future possibilities, and our past memories of it. Dima and I sat at the bar waiting for our burgers, Dima sipping water and I lemonade. At one point, she turned to me in her intense and heartfelt voice and said, in English, "Our lives are like superhero comic strips. You know how in the comics, when there's fighting going on, oftentimes the next slide says, 'in the meanwhile'? Well, that's us. We are in the meanwhile. We live in the meanwhile. While the war went on above and around us, while the displaced tended to their lives, in the meanwhile, we ate at Roadster, had meetings, went out for a drink, worked on humanitarian relief operations, and conducted our everyday lives the way we saw fit. If in the meanwhile was a way people lived through conflict, for me it became a lens through which to think about social life amid political violence and the protracted nature of conflict that has existed in Lebanon. Dima, it seems, meant to say that in the interstices of war, people still live their lives and take their breaks. Indeed, war can intensify social life, as she later told me. I, too, lived my life during the war. I spent days and nights in conversations and debates with family. I watched the war live on TV, and I enjoyed nights of drinking with new friends. In this war, I also found time to love. War, whatever war, does not necessarily erase either daily actions or emotions. It reshifts and reconfigures, but its processes are not very good at total erasure. It tries, and I believe we all know it tries very hard to erase. But it cannot destroy our human emotions or our connections to the techniques of everyday life that came before the war and that are transferred down generationally. So people continue to live in the meanwhile of war in ways that can sustain a sense of everyday normalcy and that may resemble, if only ever so slightly, the way life was lived prior to a given outbreak of war. The July 2006 war lasted 33 days. For most of the time after that and during my fieldwork, the bombings, gunfire, and armed confrontations between political groups were seemingly absent. In such times, I was struck by people's preoccupation with the idea that a war, in its vaguely defined terms, was on the horizon. And it got me thinking about the anticipation of political violence. Al-Harb jay, the war is coming, or Rahtula al-Harb, the war is going to ignite, and their various derivatives were phrases I would regularly hear in a family dining room, around a restaurant table, or at a local political party office. And I investigate such sentiments in the book. Whereas the physicality and perpetration of war is often felt as absent, or in the past or future. Talk of war, imagining it, sensing it, being tense and frustrated by it, feeling despair, resignation, fear, and hope by it. These are some of the ways that war remains constantly present, conceptually and not necessarily physically, as a structuring force in our social lives. But the war is not absent. And I actually interrogate this notion in the book. Instead of thinking of political violence in binary terms of absent and present, I think of it in terms of a spectrum from the visible to the invisible. And thinking about it this way leads me to focus on the intensities of political violence that brings war out of invisibility. The intensities of political violence refers to the differing ways in which people feel, experience, and locate themselves in a particular violent event. The intensification, to borrow from Sara Ahmed, is how political violence materializes and takes shape, how it is embodied, and how its borders and surfaces are produced and made visible for the people who are in its midst. The normal everyday can mute intensity and therefore mask conflict. In this way, what researchers, journalists, military strategists, combatants, and civilians call the front lines can be complicated. These lines are constructed and they are lived through intensity. The anticipation and recollection of political violence become other markers of this intensity, as these processes persistently keep past and future war accessible. The book is divided into two parts. Part one, I look at the anticipation of political violence and how it could be sensed in the meanwhile of physical conflict, as well as in its absence. What kind of strategies, or in its invisible times, what kind of strategies do people employ in order to live in the meanwhile? How are people in Lebanon living and experiencing the aftermath and in-betweens of war, assassinations, bombings, and the various other acts and events, often grouped together as political violence? How could one rethink this other than in terms of resilience, a recurring theme that seemed to produce forms of Lebanese exceptionalism, that somehow Lebanese were uniquely resilient for the way they conducted their lives during and after the war? People were living in the midst of armed conflict or in the shadow of threats that war might ignite. And I wanted to foreground their experiences. It is one objective of this book, then, to explore how people live in the meanwhile, of political conflict and instability, and to do so in a way that does not totalize and sensationalize the experience of violence or make violence and coping with it the only concern of people in conflict zones. So there is more to us than war and conflict. It's not only that. And I hope that I'm successful enough to get that across while talking about violence and war. Moreover, I ask how society is reconfigured in periods of political violence and subsequent calm, and how the possibility of future war inscribes recollections of past civil conflicts into everyday life. Such experiences lead me to study political violence through its practices of anticipation, to better understand how the memory or expectation of impending political violence shapes social interactions and political relationships with the state. And by practices, I mean the mundane acts, the gestures, the conversations, psychological states, and interactions. And I feel that this focus on practices of anticipation can expose ironies, contradictions, political antagonisms in the spaces of everyday life. And the ethnographic episode at the end hopefully draws out some of these contradictions. Memory emerges as another fundamental part of the story and is the focus of part two. The anticipation of political violence cannot be extricated from recollections of past wars. So this future thinking is very much connected to how we remember the past. And we should see the passage from past to future in Lebanon as a seamless duration where recollection and anticipation are simultaneous processes that meld into each other. The flow of memory between past and future, how people experience this, and what they do with it is crucial to our understanding of how political violence is experienced, especially in its invisible forms. In part two, I'm especially concerned with how people in Lebanon consciously forget, tanasi, so how they consciously forget past war, how their spontaneously lived memory works as a strategy for dealing with everyday life, and how this memory connects the past to the future. In Arabic, the word tanasi, from nasa, to forget, generally translates to choosing to forget, to the subject's active engagement in forgetting, or conscious forgetting, which implies an undercurrent of remembrance and an agency in forgetting. This concept more seriously captures what was occurring in Lebanon in the so-called post-war years. And if one listens carefully, one can sometimes hear people in Lebanon say, in relation to a TV program or a cultural event about the war, that they have had enough and have actively forgotten the war, nasayn al-harb, rather than use the construction nsin al-harb. The consciousness and agency embedded in the process of tanasi more accurately reflects the type of forgetting a collective can partake in. And I couldn't find a word for that conscious forgetting in English. There's anamnesis is a kind of conscious remembering. Rather than any state-enforced amnesia or remembering, there was an abrogation of responsibility on the part of the state, which left a narrative of the war open to interpretation. In fact, if the state enforced anything, it was to lead the way to multivocal expressions of memory. Instead of sponsoring amnesia, which perhaps only a strong, controlling state could do, the state opened the way for interpretation and expression that resulted in the intensification of an everyday lived memory of war, as if its time did not stop in the past. The state was neither able to make the population totally forget, nor did it have the will to call for remembering the war in the past, without constantly regenerating its future possibility from within the present. People in Lebanon were not living in a time after war, where they had become more peaceful so long as they remembered it was past. Instead, they were constantly reminded that they were living in a time in between. War around the corner in a future time, and war past made the present unstable, precarious, and contested. And to a large extent, the politics of no victor, no vanquished, la ghalib, la maghlub, forms the undercurrent for this book. In its basic form and re-emphasized after every conflict, this politics implies that no political party or sect in Lebanon can eliminate any other party or sect, and that all political groupings must be represented in the political system. This is to ensure al-aish al-mushtarak, coexistence, and al-wahda al-wataniyya, national unity, and to preserve Lebanon as a place that is tolerant of diverse religions. The sense that no winners or losers emerge from any single conflict contributes to the idea that causes remain unresolved. This politics creates a form of reconciliation, actually, between elites whereby the rest of society is asked to reconcile with continuing inequality as a morally acceptable alternative in the aftermath of violence. In this way, through the power-sharing function of a policy of no victor, no vanquished, violence is averted in favor of a silm al-ahli, civil peace. The politics of fear that emerges leads to a politics of compromise. It is an essentially liberal politics motivated by a Hobbesian project of keeping violence at bay, whereby politicians seek ways to prevent the always, according to them, inevitable war that will destroy the country, instead of practicing an ethical politics of seeking good for victims. So it's my contention that the constant anticipation and recollection of political violence and living in the perpetual coming crisis are a result and reinscription of this kind of politics. Between the two parts of this book, I hope to show the urgency and necessity for a new politics that would be able to reflect the moral imperatives of protecting minorities with the practical implications of building a state for all its residents. And I intentionally say residents, not citizens. Must people in Lebanon remain captive to a politics of no victor, no vanquished, as the only model for sustaining political life? So I want to provide a kind of ethnographic episode now, just to give you a sense of the kind of, I guess, narrative parts of this book and the sort of stories. I heard the phrase "tinzakar ma tin'ad," and this episode also kind of brings together some of these themes, the idea of no victor, no vanquished, and tanasi, and hopefully they come together in this episode. I heard the phrase "tinzakar ma tin'ad" often in my conversations with ex-fighters. I want to draw out one way this phrase is mobilized and some of the ambiguity embedded in memory work. I also aim to show in this episode how the victim status that results from a politics of no victor, no vanquished can manifest in the way someone like Zuzu, a former militia fighter with the Kataib, remembers, perceives, and talks about the past. So this story occurs with this one former militia fighter that I worked with. I met Zuzu around 4 p.m. on a Tuesday by Virgin Megastore in downtown. It was one of many walks I did with people in the city. We walked across the street to the Martyrs Square statue. As we approached, Zuzu began to recall for me how he was shot in the leg by a sniper as he hoisted the Kataeb flag on the statue, sometime in the early 80s. He had made his way one eerily quiet morning across the deserted space that had become the center of downtown. On both sides, ghost-like buildings, their facades peeled away by years of fighting, peered over him as he scampered across the square. Zuzu, still the pre-adolescent teen, climbed the statue with his smallish hands and feet and stuck the flag in the torch held high by one of the statue figurines. But as he was done, a bullet penetrated his leg, the only part of his body visible through the gaps in the statue from the Azariya building not too far away. We stood in front of the statue for some time. Zuzu told me he would like to bring his children here someday just to stand in the same place and take pictures. We then began walking to Foch Street. Zuzu spent several years fighting on this front. He told me how they used to name the area, and he tried to remember different zones they called Alpha 1, Alpha 2, and Alpha 3. He then told me about Roni, his good friend who was shot to death as he laid injured in the middle of the street. Roni and some of Zuzu's other comrades had been playing a nightly game of daring each other to go into an enemy building. After entering the building, they were meant to steal something symbolic as proof of accomplishment. The enemy, in this case the Murabitun, finally discovered this prank and one night planted an ambush. And it was during this fatal game that Roni was killed. At one point, Zuzu said, "I told you in the past that I've been trying to forget, to not remember the past, so that I don't affect my kids with that." I cut him off and exclaimed, "But you always remember." He could not deny this to me after all the times we had hung out together, and I had seen him around family and friends. So he downplayed this issue of remembering, telling me, "Yeah, maybe when we are sitting in a social gathering, we remember. We talk about when we did this or that. Remember when you tied him up? Do you remember when we sniped someone? Yes, things like that we remind each other of." If these otherwise terrible events were things being remembered, then I wondered, what exactly was he trying to forget? Moments later, he would utter, "The days of the war were not good." But I called him out on this again. How many times had he said the exact opposite? He tried to recover with ambiguous statements. He told me how he had lost opportunities because of the war, whereas others did something with their lives. Then he said, "But if we did not fight, then maybe the country would have been lost. Maybe if it weren't for us, then all this," and he points around, "wouldn't be here." Our conversation drifted and finally came to a pause, and after some silence, he said, "Shu بدنا نخبرك," followed by a pause. Then, contradicting his earlier response, he said with a sigh, "Iyam halwa." Those were good days. Another pause, and then, in a soft voice, "We would in the winter sit in these shops and see each other lighting a fire and covering up in that cold. Had you seen the guys then and lived those days, Sami, you would have written the most beautiful book, Wahiyat Uladi. You could have found someone to bring you down here, and you would have lived it and produced a great story, because you would have been seeing, not hearing the stories, and then wondering if people are exaggerating. But I'm telling you all this now, and I feel like I am there and living it, sitting on the front, and as if someone is talking to me. I get sad when I remember these memories. I get sad about my country and what happened to it. We are the victims here in Lebanon. It isn't my fault or yours. It is the big players who are at fault. Here is a man who by many accounts was a perpetrator, perceiving himself as a victim as he grapples with whether to forget or remember. His sentiments are very similar to those in cultural representations and productions of the war, and to the way formerly armed people have remembered the war in the media. He chooses to accept the dominant position that the Lebanese were all victims, and decides to work his memory through this lens of victimization and actively forget his role of perpetrator. Collective memory is given expression through such readings of the past, where even perpetrators become victims, and where people like Zuzu adopt the convenient master narrative that claims, "We are all victims." We stood for an hour on Foch Street, where Zuzu spent much of his childhood as an armed militiaman from age 12. Then we walked back up to the busier Wegan Street, and I realized that we have names of streets that at least I can't pronounce, which is kind of embarrassing. From here, we were able to see the martyr's statue, and speak Latin language, so people, how do you say that name?
John?
Wegan?
Begun?
From here, we were able to see the martyr's statue again, and somehow this returned us back to Zuzu's opening story about getting shot as he hoisted the party flag. He wondered about the whole incident and thought again about the sniper shooting him. Then, a 10-second pause, a sigh, a nostalgic release. حلوة الذكريات. Beautiful, memories are beautiful. Oh, really, I exclaimed, knowing I had hit the nerve I was trying to get at and arrived at that ambivalent space between active forgetting, anasi, and the pleasure of remembrance. Yes, but then you think between yourself and you think of all the people, he started to say, almost as though backtracking. I interrupted. I'm not talking about the people that were lost, but how you remember and the nice... Zuzu cut me off. Look, Sami, yes, it's nice. Doesn't the saying go tinzakar bas ma tin'aad? We remember, but we don't want to repeat the story. We don't want to let the war return. But they were good days. Iyam khair. Sami, you would spend something like 10 liras and get in return 20,000. Now you have to think twice before you spend $10 and where you're going to make your next buck. Zuzu's use of the slogan above seems like a co-optation of its original intent, and I wonder if civil society actors had in mind for people to remember the war as being good days. Zuzu remembered the war, but not only its evil past, its good days as well. Even the evils of the past, Lebanon's war, had good elements, and to deny this would itself be to deny people of a past. Zuzu's remembering does not seem to fit in with neat ideas of memory being a panacea for Lebanon's problems. His remembrance was not a type of therapy, since remembering past war in order to keep it in the past seemed to conflict with the good times he did not want to let go of. Times that he likely associated with his youth, with freedom, and getting away from the structuring limitations of both kin and state, all of which were related to a sense of power over himself. In any case, there was, here and in many other discussions we had, a disconnect between saying one wanted to forget, tanasi, and then really forgetting, nasa. Talk of forgetting was never far away from actually remembering, from engaging past memories and experiences, and from making those memories visible. Zuzu said he wanted to remember but not repeat the war, and he was not the first to express this to me, nor was it just people who formerly carried arms. However, few expressed an interest to confront the master narrative of equal victimization on all sides, the narrative of no victim, no vanquished, or to deal with the moral ambiguities and ambivalence that arose from not having a clear idea of who were the victims and who the executioners. Zuzu's acceptance of the victimhood status was a symptom of this moral ambiguity. In all this, one witnesses a work of memory, as in, Zuzu was remembering and engaging the parts of the past he wanted to forget. But there is no emphasis on truth-telling and assuming responsibility for the past. This memory is not forgotten. It can be triggered by the slightest mundane act, sight, or object. It is memory formed in the fluidity and spontaneity of everyday life. And rather than repressed memories, we may think of them in the form of archived or livable memories. Or if we pay attention to the way people speak, to their behaviors, to what is written and disseminated, to art, to literature, and to the media, we start to see this archive work as a daily reminder that the past is still lived in the present, and that these are livable memories that people access as strategies for everyday life. In absence of state accountability of the war, of truth-telling mechanisms, and of asserting a structure for the dissemination of history, this idea that there are no history books that talk about the war. Debate has continued to focus on memory, a process so alive, spontaneous, and intense that it might be time to recognize it for what it is. One would then be able to ask if it is not necessary, instead, to accept the way society lives its memory in the present as practice, rather than as a site of memory, and to accept the way society produces or consumes memory rather than force a specific notion of how to remember and forget. We would then, perhaps, be able to move away from constructing memory as a panacea or as a process that society in Lebanon must engage with as though it were not already doing so. So, I want to conclude quickly with actually to read to you the last paragraph of the book. And books are never really a complete project in and of themselves. No book ends on the final page for the author, no matter how much we'd like it to sometimes, and no matter how much we'd like to move on. It just sort of keeps coming back, and you see new things all the time. One could keep writing. The violence is continual, after all, and the stories keep coming. It is now exactly 10 years since my first encounters with Dima. The two of us are sitting once again at a cafe not too far from where this fieldwork all began. You should look at videos of the war, she says. I see them and can't believe how beautiful our city was. I watch the videos and feel like today we are living the effects of their war as the city is being destroyed all around us. Dima echoes what I've heard before. Beirut's heritage is being erased as we live in these times of never-ending post-war. Dima shows me the videos on her smartphone, and where there is a burning building, she notices beautiful artisanal windows. Where there is a sandbag barricade, she sees stunning architecture giving character to the city. She'd take those times over ours any day. It is nostalgia to cope with the present, I'm sure. But, she tells me, she'd rather live the past war than its not-so-subtle effects that destroy our city 100 times over today. There is at one and the same moment a past that is dead, and another past that continues so destructively into our future. A past that kills, if not our bodies, then our homes, our cities, our villages, and our futures. It is between this past and these futures, a space where we live in the meanwhile, that this book has tried to excavate. So, I'll thank you.
Nikolas, Dr. Nikolas Kosmatopoulos.
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to IFI in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Media Studies. Today I'm going to be discussing Sami's wonderful book with my three hats, let's put it this way. One as an anthropologist and a friend. We've been actually doing research and fieldwork at the same time with Sami, been discussing drafts together in different occasions, and somehow I feel that this book is also, maybe I'm somewhere there with a pseudonym or anonymized, who knows? Maybe not, it doesn't really matter. My second role is as an also anthropologist who works on political violence, all by it, through a different perspective, through the perspective of experts on peace, crisis, and conflict resolution. And this is also how I'm going to be discussing the book. And third, which I don't think it's equally important, I come from a country that experienced the civil war 30 years before the Lebanese civil war and the beginning of the Cold War, which makes it interesting maybe in comparison that while Lebanon's civil war was the last of the Cold War, Greek civil war was the first of the Cold War. Somehow the Greek civil war opened the Cold War that ended with the Lebanese civil war. And having said that, it's not just about how close we are. It's already a commentary how close our experiences are, but also a commentary about why, in fact, there is nothing, as far as I know, to compare the experiences of these two wars. Somehow the line between us and them is drawn somewhere in the Bosporus. While the Greek civil war is understood as a European civil war, the Lebanese civil war is understood as an Arab, Middle Eastern civil war, although I think that there would be much to gain if we look at these civil wars together. One of the things to be gained, for example, would be start speaking about the Lebanese civil war less and less in terms of a sectarian civil war, and looking at it as a political, social, structural civil war, whose many of the occasions and the regions and the roots are still with us today. And this is how I understood war is coming. And I will be speaking from that perspective. All of that makes my task very challenging, But at the same time, my task is quite easy because I'm the only one who has read the book here. So I can say whatever I want. It's my word against yours, Sami. So I think the book has at least three important contributions to do. The first is the anthropological study of political violence. The second contribution is towards what one could broadly describe as the ethnographic genre of writing war. And the third one is contribution to the question of peace in post-war Lebanon, and if you wish, post-war societies at large. The anthropology of violence, speaking about the first contribution, is a relatively new field. Strangely, although there has been violence around the world since a while, the anthropologists woke up to the task of discussing violence pretty late. Around that time, I think that the Lebanese civil war ended. That was the time where the anthropology of violence took off. And of course, there are many interesting reasons to discuss why this happened. Why was only that time that anthropology of violence became a dominant and a bona fide research field. So it is worth asking, and I think this is what Sami does, why was political violence problematized, and how was it problematized, and what kind of arguments, filters, and approaches. Today, anthropology of violence is an established field, and Sami's contribution is definitely one important contribution to this field. And the commitment of the anthropology of violence today is to address invisible forms and unaccounted agents of violence, exactly as Sami does, but also in describing and analyzing the experience of violence among those who live it or who have lived it. So War is Coming indeed belongs to this genre, and I think it's an important contribution to this genre, and does for Lebanon what others might have done about Ireland, Colombia, Yugoslavia, Algeria, Sri Lanka, and places around the world where the war is still coming. So at the same time is a local ethnography, but at the same time speaks to a global issue about how violence is being felt and understood in different places around the world that have experienced war. Sami writes that he took an approach, quote, focusing on the invisible forms of political violence that go unnoticed. And to bring this point home, he refers to the by now famous opening scene by Foucault in Discipline and Punish, in which the potential kingslayer, to speak in terms of Game of Thrones, since we are also already on the title, alluding to the Game of Thrones, the title of the book, I mean. So the potential kingslayer is killed in the public panegyric of torture and humiliation orchestrated by the state. For those of you who have read the book, for those of you who haven't read the book, read it. So Foucault says that these previous forms of violence are actually now invisible. They are somehow brought in the shadows of the state, and you don't anymore see them as a celebration of the state. And Sami actually takes the project from there to show us exactly that the war is still here, that the violence is not yet past. So the book asks, given this omnipresence, how is violence thought, felt, anticipated, remembered, problematized? The focus of the book is not on the cultural producers, not the politicians, not the memory makers, but rather on the everyday producers and consumers, what Sami reluctantly calls the people in Lebanon. To humanize the experience of violence, Sami employs the analytic concepts of scale and intensity. He suggests that there are adequate filters to think through and analyze violence with. In trying to grasp the category of violence, the ethnography focuses on the ambiguities, diverse meanings, experiences, categorizations, but also specific acts, practices, impacts, and behaviors of violence. In this process, the reader is constantly reminded that the academic black box of violence is simply not. Violence is, as a general category, wouldn't do. It needs specifics, it needs contextualization, it needs stories, it needs ethnographic sensibility and downscaling. We need to talk about experiences, people, scenes, and moments of experience of violence. The book, in that sense, reads as an ethnographic interrogation of the academic category of violence, or as a letter of protest against those who talk about violence in such a distant manner through graphs, statistics, and stereotype labels such as failed states and ethnic conflict. The war in Lebanon is not over. I think we could summarize one of the book's arguments. Since it is always anticipated, it is always remembered, the war is still here. The alternate title, I think, was La Ghalib La Maghlub, right? So no victors, no vanquished. The magical formula that allowed the elites in Lebanon to rule over a population in constant fear of the war. Sami's book can be read, I think, as a first-class lesson in governing populations through the constant fear of war. We can hear, or at least I can hear, echoes of Benjamin, quote, "The tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception, but the rule." I think here's an important Benjaminian argument that he's reluctant to make, but since I'm not the author of the book, I can make it, it's for free. Performing state failure, that is, the constant possibility of civil war, is an elaborate strategy to govern post-war Lebanon by the elites. Is in fact not a failure. It's a conscious strategy of scaring the population into submission. But this strategy has unintended consequences too, and here's where the book focuses, namely the effects of anticipation and recollection of violence. Sami shows how violence forms affective communities, how people have been through violence become the post-war community of violence. It is worth asking here whether war turned the Lebanese into a nation. The memory of the war, the experience of the war, the participation in the war, is actually contributed to the nation-making effect in Lebanon. Does war make Lebanon? And does war make Lebanese? Do people unite on the basis of the experience of violence and the skills of anticipation? Resilience, that's another word that the book is, it's very common in the book. Resilience, quoting the book, violence is something that someone lives with in spite of. Sami shows in the book how war equips people with social and survival skills. It enhances the imagination of techniques, the knowledge of sanctuaries, and moving between places. War teaches life. War teaches how to move in the city. War teaches how to move in life. That's what Sami says. Perhaps this is also why there is a celebration of the war. These were the good days, as some of his interlocutors say. But it also shows how weak bonds of solidarity still persist and often make people apathetic to the pain of others, in the case of the July war, where some of Lebanon was bombed while the other half was celebrating. This book also reads, to paraphrase Arendt, as a report in the banality of violence, particularly through the question of time, the division between eventful time, the events, wars, bombings, and banal, excruciatingly boring time. It's a very interesting argument that anthropologists keep on doing, that there's a lot of boredom going on in situations of war. It's not all such exciting, in fact. Sami joins the anthropological literature that resists the eventualization of violence, the spectacularization of violence. Violence is present even when not visible, even when not reported in the media, even when the cameras are off. So, all that together, one of the things that I would like to ask is that, you did this thing opening the book with Foucault, and then, some of us who might be understood as Foucauldians or whatever that means, would like to see more of that, especially in terms of how do you account, let's say, for the category of violence epistemologically and genealogically. What do you think it means, that the fact that the study of violence came up when it came, and how does the book deals with the epistemological study of violence? How do you understand violence in terms of how we speak about it? How academics and the ones who don't talk about the book, let's say, would they speak about violence, and would that matter in your perception of violence? I talk about the way that actually many of the ones that matter, people who tell us what kind of violence Lebanon went through, feature in the book. To give an example, again, many of the ones that matter, the ones who speak about Lebanese violence in the media, especially in the West, that speak about a sectarian war. How does that matter? That's my question. How does that, trickle down in this economical sense to the people talking about violence in everyday life? Has they been, convinced, the ones that you talk about, that it was a sectarian war, or was it another kind of war? And I'm saying that why? Because I think also in your ethnography, there has been always instances that allude to another kind of war, even in your example now, that allude to a structural war, an economic war, a war of the rich against the poor. And even the case where your friend or your interlocutor talked about the war was a great time, he referred to the war in economic terms. Everything was much cheaper now. Now we cannot even buy anything. This is, for many in Lebanon, a war after the end of the war. It's a structural war that actually has been ongoing not only on memory, but also on the economic plane. So how do you feature? How does your war, this kind of war, features in your post-war, ethnography? And this is my first big question. Now the second one, how much time is there left?
You've got more time.
Thanks. The second one is the second contribution. I think it's an important contribution is to the genre of writing war. Anthropology had its first major crisis, at least in the 80s, around the debate: how do we write culture? How do we, as anthropologists, are ethically and politically committed to our subjects, to the people who we write about? And that brought about a huge crisis in the discipline, which is until today known as the crisis of representation. The crisis of representation debate brought about questions, about the subject of ethnography, about the authority, who has the authority to speak on behalf of those who don't have a voice, right? The ethnographer is the one who speaks for those who don't write, who gives voice to those who don't have a voice. Many voices appear in this book who otherwise wouldn't have been appeared. Now, I think Sami takes this debate further in contributing to what a second crisis in anthropology could have been about writing violence. How do we write violence, especially when the subjects under question have been morally, politically, and sometimes physically compromised? What happens when people out there are presenting themselves, are presented as victims, hence not bona fide political subjects, or as perpetrators, hence also morally compromised people, because perpetrators are not supposed to be given the same moral high ground to speak as subjects, right? We live in an era, I think, that the representation of subjects through compromised form of representation is on the rise. Refugees, for example, are also understood as victims who have to be spoken of. Somebody has to speak about them, about their needs, about their perspectives, about the futures. That's why you have a huge domain around the refugees that speak about them. NGOs, UNHCR, UN, and who knows who else. The same goes for different forms of perpetrators. So I think this is an interesting discussion, especially because Sami comes to the discussion from a point of view of what I could call an intimate ethnography. Intimate meaning not necessarily in terms of cultural intimacy that Hertzfeld talk about, but very intimate in the sense that he's actually doing research among members, family members too. And this is, I think, a challenging question which somehow runs the risk of presenting the ethnographer always in a moral and political and somehow physical distance from the question of where the victims of violence or the perpetrators of violence stand. So how, and I think that you were grasping also, struggling in the book to find your place, vis-a-vis people who have committed crimes. And because I don't think you spoke enough about it, I would just ask you what do you think is the ethical and the political space of the ethnographer vis-a-vis subjects of violence today? Yes. This is also another way of saying, the fact that there was a focus on a particular group in the war, especially a political group in the war. I think that what you could also tell us more is about how you, especially because you declare in the book that you are politically now elsewhere, or you are elsewhere. It's always a challenge how to do ethnography among people who, you disagree with. Let me put it very lightly. How do we do, because anthropology actually has shifted, from being a discipline that wanted to amplify the voices of the voiceless, somehow showing kind of a sympathy, an epistemological sympathy to our subjects. Now we have to do ethnography with fascists, for example, in the Trump era. How do you do ethnography with fascists? How do we do ethnography with killers? How do we do ethnography with people we don't really like? I think these are very interesting issues. And how do you draw the line between, representation and affect in that sense? The third contribution that I see the book is making is the question of peace in post-war Lebanon and in general in post-war societies. So the book indeed talks about the formula, the end of the Lebanese war, the formula that there will be no victor and no loser, but also implies that we live in a situation that can be characterized as a no war but no peace either. The book argues that against the first policy formula, articulated initially after the 1958 war, and against the formula of no victor, no vanquished, but it also complicates the meaning of peace. Peace is not achieved through the signing of peace agreements. I think we should by now agree on that. Palestine, Yugoslavia, and recently Libya and Colombia are dire witness to that. Peace doesn't mean that comes with a peace agreement. In fact, it might be, and this is what the Greek Civil War shows, and this is what you're going to see also in Colombia, unfortunately, that after peace signing, this is where the real war starts. What happened in Greece after the left signed the peace agreement and demilitarized, they have been slaughtered by the right for 4 years and ongoing. So it's not really clear how does the post-war situation features. So the book challenges, I think, exactly this easy division of human experience into peace, war, certainty, uncertainty, normality, violence, eventuality, banality, objective, subjective forms of violence. And eventually also, I think, the compartmentalization of the Lebanese into neatly contained sects, right? As I read the book, I'm also interested to hear you how you want to maybe analyze that part. So there's no sectarianism in the hope for peace. But the same idea, I think it's that, what the book also shows is that, as a post-war situation, what mattered was in fact not reconciliation, but accountability. Not necessarily, holding hands, but holding people, responsible. It's not about, just reconciliation had to come with accountability, and that's the only way I think that people do not forget. So the active not forgetting has to do with this kind of structural conditions that I think that through the book also you're saying that they're still with us today. So one of the reasons I think that the war is not coming, is still coming, or at least is still there also in terms of memory, and this is also my question to you, is about the structural conditions, the social conditions that led to the war in the first place. at least a social understanding of war, or the Lebanese civil war, doesn't necessarily start on the 15th of April, but starts with the killing of the fish workers in Saida, which was a social strike and not necessarily a sectarian attack. And these conditions are still with us today, if not worse. You know, the war of the rich against the poor is actually intensifying, and I think much of the situation adds up to with the presence of the refugees today. So is this also part of the war we're talking about? And how would you, fish out, talk about these instances in a second, maybe, reading of the book? I think that everything of that is there. I'm just saying, I feel that you somehow stop short sometimes before naming it or talking about the structural violence that's been omnipresent, and of course the regional war that is still ongoing, which actually makes difficult any pacification of Lebanon, because it's not easy to have peace where everybody else around you has war. And that's my last question in terms of your method. This is maybe where we also come from different perspectives. Sami's approaches, Sami's method is a method phenomenological, right? This is what phenomenology. And I would be more into the genealogical method. I'm much more interested in how violence has been understood and imposed, how meanings of violence are imposed on other people. But I think Sami's method is very important because it shows exactly how people, everyday people, actually feel and experience and talk about violence in everyday life. But at the same time, I think if we combine the two, then Sami would be also somehow interrogated as somebody whose filter on violence was very much, a concrete one. He had a very particular understanding of what violence he talks about, and that was actually the violence of the war. And the war was ended somehow in the 1990s. So even if the argument of the book is that the war is still with us, somehow I feel that sometimes the way that you were asking questions was, of course, referring to the war that ended in 1990. And this is where I end. Thanks.
Nikolas, thank you very much. Sami, you have about 10 minutes. Okay.
Hopefully it won't take that long. But first of all, thank you so much. There are parts of what you were saying in the beginning that I felt like I should have given you the book before and then had you write the introduction, because I felt like some of it was well articulated in terms of what I was trying to do, so thanks. And so I wanted to speak to a couple of issues that you raise. On the issue of writing war and this idea of, what do you do with your ethical position towards these kind of, in some ways, you said compromised subjects, and either they're, whether it's perpetrators or victims. In some ways, there was an article today in The Guardian by George Saunders who talks about how and I felt good about reading this, because he says that if you produce the book that you intended to write from the beginning, then you really I forget the rest of the quote.
There was no point in writing.
There was no point in writing, right? Okay. So this wasn't the intended book. The intended book would have actually dealt with that question much more deeply, because I set out to write a book about former militia fighters. That was the book I intended to write. And along the way, I didn't confine myself to working just with former militia fighters. I was working, as I said earlier, with these different groups of people. And I realized that this thread actually was connecting all these groups of people. And in some ways, I found this to be the more sort of pressing or interesting topic that I wanted to cover. And so I hope my book 2 or 3 will eventually go back to this, really this treasure of data that I never deal with, which are these interviews and ethnographic work with former fighters that appear in this book slightly, but it's really not about them. They are there to serve another purpose of talking about anticipation of violence and so on. And so this ethical position, you're right, doesn't come up. I think it's a very important one. How does one reserve judgment while trying to understand people that one fundamentally disagrees with? And in some cases, sometimes one fundamentally disagrees with, but one fundamentally loves, right? So like there's that closeness. Right? So how does one suspend, or even how does one judge positively someone who has done something negatively? And these kind of ethical dilemmas that you're absolutely right, don't come out here. There was another thing that you talked about, the sectarian, that this was not a sectarian war. This was a political, economic war. That you're also right. I do stop short of kind of naming that structural violence. There is one point where I talk about. I quote Picard about how the war, the economies of war become the economies of peace, kind of thing. But it's really, if you're looking for that kind of economic analysis, it's not there. And partly, I like that you raised this, because this was something that I realized much later. I came to Lebanon with this wanting to be, and I say this in the introduction, of sectarian blind. In the U.S. they talk about colorblind, and we make this argument that there is no such thing as being colorblind, right? In the U.S. context, and here I came into Lebanon wanting to be sectarian blind. That it is all about politics, and no, it's not about. And so I actually didn't talk about sectarianism intentionally, and realized later on that was probably a mistake, because the political system is sectarian, and so people have been forced to interact in sectarian ways with the political system that has over time made us so. And so there, and I think part of that was in so doing, I kind of brush that. But the other thing is this, the anthropology of violence. I struggled with this a lot, this question of violence, because and my earlier version of this talk was going to I was going to mention this. In Arabic, actually, if you give it a bit of thought, we don't use the word anf very often in our daily conversations. We don't use the word anf when we talk about the war or political violence. We're very specific about what we're talking about, or you are very specific about what you talk about. You might talk about atal or damar, right? So killings, the bombings, specificities, right? And the social scientist comes in and tries to kind of lump all this into violence. And it's something that, again, one of those things in the writing process, you write a chapter, you write a book, and then you revisit the chapter, you revisit the book. And in revisiting the book, you realize something like this that I realized very much later on. That I work into the book, but it becomes, I think, a tension of how do I'm a social scientist, how do I critique this, yet talk about it after I've done 10 years of research? How how does one, and I think, I hope that tension will be something for a lot of the academics out there. Hopefully you'll be able to sort of tease out, and we might be able to discuss further. But it is a tension that this society, at least, has much more specific, and I imagine other places as well have much more specific ways of thinking about these violent social processes that are going on, and how do we try to better explain that in their terms rather than in these universal terms. One thing you mentioned, the people in Lebanon. You mentioned that. This was something, so when you read the book, hopefully you'll read the book, I use a construction in the book. I never once used the word Lebanese in the book. It is always the people in Lebanon, because I wanted to say that there are people in Lebanon who are not Lebanese who also experience these same things and these same processes. And I struggle with it because the people in Lebanon also kind of then blinds you to things like class and gender, right? Because we're just all people and we all experience these things in the same way, which we don't. We don't experience them all in the same way. The poor experience it differently. Refugees experience it differently. The rich experience it differently. They have much more, privileges to escape it, for example, and so on. So this was, there was that, and then the other one that I wanted to push against was this naming the war. That I went back and forth. I don't call it a civil war. I call it Lebanon's war. And I do that because it's much more complex than being a civil war. So I try to, sort of critique these different forms of naming war in the book as well. I think that's in response to you, Nikola. That's what I'd like to say. But again, thank you. I feel like if you've listened to him, you also got a good sense of some of the ways that I was thinking about it, and some of the ways that I may not have consciously been thinking about it. That I liked the way you in your explanation of the book. Really brought out.
Write the review.
Yes, thank you. Is that?
Yes, that is absolutely sufficient. And now I'd like to ask if there are any questions in the audience for Sami. Nadim? Is there a microphone to go around? Striped shirt, second row, all the way back there.
There's a microphone there.
Oh, behind you.
Behind you, there's a microphone behind you.
Okay, two. The other microphone?
Hello. Yeah. Hi, thank you very much, student in AUB. Just a few questions about the presentation. I just want to start with your beginning when you said that somehow the goal of this was the appreciation of the other, which hints at the way you kind of saw the whole war. Because it almost kind of assumes that then you're seeing it in a kind of sectarian lens, in as much as the wars between these two sects that don't understand each other and need to reconcile. If it was seen in a more class sense, we don't need to appreciate the rich, each I'm trying to say. So in that sense, it's the very term appreciate the other, to me, is insufficient for justice. And the whole language was covered in how do we get peace? And Professor Nikolas was hinting at this, but it's not about peace, it's about justice. And the peace is just, that's the kind of liberal discourse we always hear, peace first, then justice. Now my question is more to logic of the argument between this issue of conscious forgetting and then the sudden creation of an in-between time. And I would like to point to Robert Meister's work, After Evil, because it seems like you borrow from it a lot, and that should be mentioned. And in fact, his reading is quite different, because in his reading, the past, for an in-between time to emerge, you need the past to be past. It's the past is past, then justice is in the future, so therefore the in-between time emerges as a time that will never get to justice, and justice never comes because we have to have more time for reconciliation, more time for forgiveness, more time for all these things that, we need accordingly so that we move on to a true justice. So to me, the issue, whether this reading agrees with Meister or not is irrelevant, but to me the issue is not whether how time, because in my opinion, if you're saying the war is coming, it implies that the past is not past, and implies that the time is ongoing. It's a more Benjaminian kind of reading, as was pointed out, which I appreciate. But that kind of narrative, then, if one agrees or not, to me, it's the issue of the deids. Like, victim, perpetrator is what we're talking about. But what's missing is beneficiary. That's the point of justice, and that's what's not being discussed. We're still stuck in the victim-perpetrator binary. And that's, insufficient for justice. Thank you.
I do borrow from Robert Meister, and it is, there is a section, where I go through that especially in the introduction. We can have a conversation about that I think the appreciation for the lives of others is an interesting one. I don't. It's not in the book. It's in the presentation. I take your point. I also agree with you. We need justice, not peace. But I don't think that the appreciation of the other's experience rules that out. Understanding, and I see this. Maybe in a saying that here is different than I'm thinking saying it in another, in the U.S., for example, in terms of people in the U.S. appreciating other places and other societies. So I can see how that reading here, you took that as a sectarian, thinking of the other as a sectarian. I think you'd have to read the at least the introduction to think about the Robert Meister reference.
Okay, Elmer, I have two questions, and then.
Hi, Sami.
Elmer.
Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed this kind of really two end of the spectrum reading of the book. The phenomenological one, more structural questions that came with it. So with that, I'm curious also. So you used memory as a way to think about the war and subjectivities in the war and how people remember and how people forget and all of that. And I'm wondering if I would throw a question in a different way on you. I would say, what will war help us in understanding an anthropology of memory? How would that? I mean, maybe it's in the book. I don't know, but in a way, kind of not really the topic here is the Lebanese war, but actually the notion of memory and how you understand it in terms of its kind of ideological, material, and what does war really help us, if as a methodology here, method or an approach to understanding memory or having a different argument about the literature on memory. So in a way, I'm just kind of reversing that thing that you did.
Yeah. I mean, the book is, in some ways, more about memory, because the book is split between, there's two parts: anticipation and recollection. Right? Part one is called anticipation. Part two is called recollection. And I see anticipation as a form of memory. So it really becomes about how war and political violence, let's say generally, how does that inform our understanding of the future and our connection to the past. So there is also that aspect of. How does that differ in peace? Well, I guess I would challenge that binary of war and peace, right? Of thinking about a peacetime versus a wartime. I mean, are you saying like what would be the difference between memory and?
Sorry, can you speak into the microphone, please?
So I mean, the issue is that you're talking about political violence. War is in the title. War is coming. So the question of war and kind of what happens after war is already there. So it's not like a binary between war and peace. But let's say in a context where war has not happened, how would the question of memory look in this kind of case, and how does it differ? Does it differ, or does war help you in understanding memory in a way, or doesn't? I mean, I'm just curious because I thought that that's what kind of came into my mind when I'm thinking about the.
Thanks.
Thank you. I just came late, so I don't know whether you discussed the cover of the book. Did you have a chance to comment on the cover of the book? Is there a specific choice for that particular picture? Well, because for me, while everybody around us is chopping heads, we're just cutting hair. And it's very symbolic that it could be that the Lebanese blend of violence might be of a different category than what we see around us. Could it be that Lebanon's dealing with violence falls into a different pattern of what you see somewhere else? Or does it just fit into your type 1, type 2, type 3 sort of violence as such? Thank you.
The choice of the cover, I had help from interlocutors. I will not name unless they want me to. I was trying to show. I wanted a picture because the press wanted war and violence in the title. I always imagined the book to have a cover that was showing the everyday life that can happen, and so I mean this picture actually is I don't know, you can't really necessarily tell very well. The context is it's in Night Ashab after the July 2006 war, so you have this banal kind of thing of cutting hair in this bombed out building, and I think there are continuations and extensions, the violence in Lebanon. I mean, we had some pretty gruesome things that were done. If we're talking about 1975, 1990, there were some pretty gruesome things of tying people to cars and dragging them. So it wasn't cutting heads necessarily, but there were other forms, and we build on forms of violence, right? So I imagine if we were to become embroiled in much more directly in what's happening in Syria and so on, that why not? That could happen here too, right? Pessimistically.
There's a question here in the front.
Thank you. Just a quick question, if you don't mind. You mentioned accountability. And I was wondering, how does accountability relate to memory of war? Because usually in most wars, there is accountability after a war, and this helps in a way to people to forget, quote unquote, the war. And in Lebanon, I think this is different, and there is still, up till now, no accountability. So how does this affect the memory of war?
Yeah, I have one of the chapters, one of the later chapters, actually, in chapter 8, I talk about accountability directly. And in some ways, this idea that we had amnesty and the sense of needing to, wanting to forget the war without having any sort of court. So if you take the South African experience, over there, you had courts which designated what were crimes and what what was right and wrong, and then there was a kind of amnesty on certain crimes. Over here, we didn't. So we actually, there is no, in some ways, there was no designation of what is a crime that we could then forget. Right? Or we could then forgive. We just didn't even have that. So I go through that. I try to think about that through the story of one former militia fighter who actually very proudly says, "Nahna mujrimin," and we had to be criminal in order to defend the community.
Sami, a general question. Is the Lebanese war, according to your book, unique? I mean, if we were to do a study, if you were to do a study on the Yugoslavian wars, or you just mentioned the South African war or the Greek Civil War, would you arrive at different conclusions than where you arrived in your book here? And to segue back to the question from the AUB student at the beginning, do wars such as ours get justice? I mean, even if you mention South Africa and they had these supposedly tribunals of reconciliation, we may think, or some people may think, or one side may think that there was justice achieved, but not everybody will agree.
No, I think there's certainly places of comparison, but I think political violence also takes on, attaches itself to different cultural contexts and settings and different politics, right? So one thing that I say is that, this anticipation, for example, the way we live the aftermath, you could see that in different places, but what's unique is how this place anticipates, how this place remembers. But certainly there are similarities. I mean, I think, I hope that one could, who's studying Yugoslavia could see this there, right? What's that? Yeah. On the question of justice, the problem, and going back to that, is that we don't talk about the beneficiaries of violence in Lebanon, and the way that those who benefited from the time before are also those who benefited from in the aftermath. And you see that's very clearly where they, in terms of the politicians and the elite, they divvy up political power and economic power in the aftermath. So I think at least we could start with that you are, that the beneficiaries of the war are not allowed to benefit from the peace. And that would at least be a step towards some justice, right? But yeah, we talk about we tend to talk about victims and perpetrators. And if we talk about the beneficiaries, or if we talk about if we talk about the beneficiaries, that is عم بتمس بسلم الأهلي, right? You're touching on the question of civil peace and beware, because it's in their power to return us back to the war, which then prevents us from, so we shut up, because of course we don't want to destabilize, we don't want to go back to fighting, so we shut up. So it's a very, as you said, a way to govern, right? It is ultimately a way to govern us. Through this, and I mentioned, and there is in chapter 5, I kind of touch on this, that briefly in different ways, that it's not that the elite govern us, but that we take part in. And sadly, I mean, one other thing about books is that the press controls titles, and if you talk to, at least in academia, I don't know how in the non-academic world it is, but in academia, most academics are not happy with the ultimate title. It's a sexy title, right? War is coming. It sells, but this play,
We'll see.
We'll see. Yeah, at least that was the publisher's. It will sell. But it does play a role into what I'm talking about in chapter 5, where you see images in the, and I have a bunch of images. So for those who like pictures, there's a lot of pictures in this book.
May I say something on this?
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
I didn't see any other questions, so I'm going to give the last word to Nikolas Kosmatopoulos. Now?
You just said that.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah.
Taimur Azhari, The Daily Star. Did you see any trends throughout your research over 10 years of what people thought were the initial causes for the war, or what might be causes for future wars?
Yeah,
did you in your encounters with people who you doing ethnographies and doing the research, did you see any trends? Did you see any sort of unifying factors? Was it really like a sectarian narrative, or was it more of a inequality narrative? And secondly, do you think there's any legitimacy to the idea that that sort of, because the civil war ended with a agreement of sharing power, if that system is challenged by maybe independent politics, do you think that there's any legitimacy to the idea that there could be a resurgence in violence? Because the framework that exists now is really built upon a division of the power.
Yeah, certainly. I think that the conditions in some ways are always there, and I think to your first part, yes, people spoke about, I mean, just as you were saying, like people do refer to different economic sort of injustices as roots of war, but also the sectarian to the Palestinian presence, right? So there's also the foreign element, and there is the local. In fact, a lot of people, I would argue most of the time, we're talking, 20 odd years later, no, 15, yeah, 16. People were reluctant to say it was sectarian, right? So they wouldn't say it was, especially on the Christian end, that we weren't against the Muslims. So actually, most people, so we were against the Palestinians, for example. Right? And so there's that argument, and of course there is the inequality argument coming from the left, saying that this was about unjust distribution of power and so on. So people were very much, as you know, they're aware of that. We're aware of these things. Yet the sectarian, it's one of those tropes that keep coming back, right? Even though we all know, because the media continues to talk about it as sectarian. Not this media necessarily, but the world media, that you have this constant coming back and forgetting what we actually do know.
Nikolas?
Yes. If I may, I will come back to this interesting question that you raised about comparing violence. I think it's important to think about Sami's contribution to another level too, about who is justified to speak about violence at the global level. Who can compare violent experiences? Now think that if you are, let's say, understood, or if you are somehow put back in your sectarian box, you are somehow a Croat who hates Muslims. Can you speak about global violence? No. You are too sectarian. You're too much parochial. You're into your own experience. You cannot speak about violence to an Argentinian, to a Sri Lankese. You cannot speak about only somebody who's not sectarian, who's actually rational, who's mostly probably has a particular skin color, if you wish, particular class position, and I don't think can speak about violence all over the world and can compare violence experiences. The locals are there to provide for these international thinkers data, not theories. Theory of violence can be made only in Harvard, We just experience violence. We don't have theories, we have experiences, And this is actually something that's not given. This division of labor between theory of violence and experience of violence started around the end of the Lebanese Civil War, and this is what I think it's important to also think about who has the right to speak authoritatively about violence at the global scale. As long as the Lebanese experience is been archived as sectarian, the Lebanese lose the right to speak about violence globally.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nikolas, and thank you, Sami. I remind you that the book is available over there.
Is this only the book
That
available
doorway.
or some wine too?
Is there wine?
No,